Chris Redfield from Resident Evil is the man who has saved millions of lives by solving puzzles, punching sick people in the face, and never skipping leg day. But how did Chris go from a lean member of STARS to an absolute unit in the BSAA? Is Chris natural? What the hell is this guy eating? And how heavy was that boulder anyway? We will explore these questions and more on Physiques and Geeks, where we take a look at our favorite video game icons. If you're unfamiliar with Chris Redfield, he is one of the major characters of the Resident Evil series, appearing in over a dozen games. And beginning with Resident Evil 5, Chris radically transformed from a believable protagonist into a character who would not look out of place in a Gears of War game. First, I wanted to find out his height and weight to better gauge this change, so I started by going to my handy reference book for all things Resident Evil. Whoops, not that one. I busted out my copy of Resident Evil Archives, and during the events of Resident Evil 1, Chris is listed as 5'11 and 177 pounds. He looks great. He's lean, and he has visible muscle mass, which would lead me to believe that he definitely works out. His cardio is fantastic as he spends the majority of the game at a nice jog without ever getting winded. Tracking down Chris's height and weight once he bulked up became a bit inconsistent. So I opted to use the most up-to-date information from ResidentEvil.net, which lists Chris at 6'1" and 220 pounds. Just from the eyeball test, I find 220 pounds to be the most plausible weight for our sailor friend. But 6'1"? He grew 2 inches between games? I don't have a good explanation for this. My best explanation is that during Chris's radical transformation, he either started practicing better posture, or maybe began wearing lifts in his shoes. So how exactly did Chris gain 43 pounds and achieve his incredible physique in later games? Let's see what Resident Evil Archives 2 has to say about this topic. Quote, "He's built up his body from earlier missions out of his desire to settle a score with Albert Wesker." End quote. This is referring to the beatdown that Chris receives at the end of Resident Evil Code Veronica. Spoilers for a 23-year-old game. But it's perfectly reasonable. Many people have a negative experience and decide to pour that energy into something fruitful, like working out. However, not many people transform into a 220-pound wrecking machine as a result. But hey, dare to dream. Chris was obviously lifting weights and focusing on strength training. He's also surprisingly agile for a man his size. He jumps out of windows, he sprints, rolls, dodges. So now we have to ask the question, is Chris natural? Or did he use performance-enhancing drugs to achieve this physique? Well, there's 2 ways to look at this. We can view it from a gameplay perspective, where for the sake of making a fun video game mechanic, things happen in Resident Evil games that don't really correspond to reality, like interconnected item boxes, first aid sprays that heal all wounds, etc. And if we accept these gameplay systems as being representative of reality, then we have to look to the fact that in Resident Evil 7, Not a Hero, Chris is clearly injecting himself with an assortment of steroids that he finds in an underground salt mine with no doctor supervision in sight. So from that perspective, Chris is not natural. The other way to look at this is as if Chris were a real person. Chris has the physique of a world-class bodybuilder, which in and of itself is a full-time job. Yet on top of an extraordinary physique, he's also finding the time to constantly deploy on missions for the BSAA. What I did want to examine further in detail is really the limits to Chris's strength to better determine if he's natural or not. So like any sane person, I wanted to find out how the he punched a boulder out of his way in a volcano during the events of Resident Evil 5. So let's do some napkin math here. First, I assume the boulder is a perfect sphere. I also assume that it is made of basalt, a common volcanic rock with a density of 2.9 grams per cubic centimeters. The boulder appears to be roughly 2.5 times Chris's height. Have that, and we get a radius of 228.75 centimeters. Now to calculate the acceleration, it looks to me like it traveled about 15 feet in 5 seconds, giving it an acceleration of 1.2 feet per second squared. Still with me? Let's calculate the volume of this sphere, where volume equals 4/3 times pi times the radius cubed. The volume of the boulder is over 50 million cubic centimeters, or 50.14 cubic meters. But we want to know how much it weighs, so using the density of basalt, we can do that. Mass equals 4/3 times pi times the radius cubed times 2.9, which is the density of the rock. After unit conversion, we end up with a boulder weighing 320,554 pounds. Okay, so I can tell that's a lot of weight, but to my tiny human brain, it's kind of hard to quantify. So let's look at this a different way. How much force did Chris have to exert to move this thing? Force equals mass times acceleration. So 145,401 kilograms, which is the weight of the boulder, times 1.2 feet per second squared, which is the acceleration, gives us 53,181 newtons of force. According to NASA, the average human maximum push is 251 newtons. So Chris is exerting about 212 times the maximum force achievable by a human. And I didn't even account for friction, which would have made Chris's force exerted even higher. So based on punching a 320,000-pound boulder with 212 times the maximum force able to be exerted by a human, Chris is by far and away the strongest human who ever existed in the world, and I do not know of any natural bodybuilders or strongmen who even come close to this feat. So with that as my conclusion, Chris Redfield is not natural. Never mind that he does all of this in an active volcano where he should be bursting into flames from the heat of the air. So despite most likely using steroids, PEDs, or perhaps a unique strain of virus, hey, it is Resident Evil after all, Chris still has a killer physique and he is tough as hell. However, training alone won't get you these results, and we're going to look at the foundation of every physique, the nutrition. Now, we rarely see Chris eat in these games, and if Resident Evil were realistic, he would likely be traveling with a cooler full of prepared meals at all times during his missions, and this is because to maintain his mass, Chris needs to eat a lot. I was curious as to what Chris's estimated TDEE was, or total daily energy expenditure. This is the amount of calories needed to maintain your current weight. Or another way to look at this is these are the calories you burn from your daily activities. It will be lower for a sedentary person and higher for somebody with a high activity level. If you weigh more and if you have higher muscle mass, your TDEE will also be higher. It takes more calories simply to maintain muscle mass compared with somebody who has very little muscle mass. So I used a great tool, tdeecalculator.net, which has usually been pretty accurate for me. I'm estimating Chris at about 10% body fat, though there's no way to be certain since he's not real, but he is extremely lean for his size. 35 years old, 6'1", 220 pounds, and I set his activity level to the highest setting because he is essentially a peak athlete just based on his performance in these games. The calculator gives me a TDEE of 4,389 calories per day for Chris, and I believe it. He is constantly on the go, his conditioning is fantastic, and he looks like a world-class bodybuilder. Say that Chris wanted to slim down a bit, he could eat 4,000 calories a day and still lose weight, which is more than what most people eat in a day. So I thought it'd be fun to take a look at a couple meals Chris is likely to eat to support his high caloric needs, while also making sure that he's getting proper macronutrients to support his awesome physique. We know that Chris is an egg hoarder, and the yolks of eggs are a great source of fat. When you need as many calories as Chris does, this makes eggs a great option since fat is more calorically dense than protein or carbohydrates. Fat has 9 calories per gram, while protein and carbs both have 4 calories per gram. So something like an 8-egg omelet with a cup of oatmeal prepared with whole milk would be a great breakfast for Mr. Redfield, and that would clock in at 945 calories, 66 grams of protein, 49 grams of fat, and 60 grams of carbs. We also need to make sure Chris is getting plenty of protein so that he can continue to recover and support his muscles after his strenuous workouts. other meals that would make sense for Chris would be a roasted half chicken with a cup of white rice. Since we see him consume herbs constantly, I figured a nice green herb, or in our case, arugula, salad would work quite nicely. And that would provide an 1,100 calorie meal with 93 grams of protein, 56 grams of fat, and 55 grams of carbs. Chris is also an avid fisherman, so I figured I'd find a fairly fatty fish for a fatigued, famished fan favorite hero like Chris. I chose mackerel, which provides 19 grams of protein and 14 grams of fat per 100 gram serving size. Side note for Capcom, can we please get Fisherman Chris as an unlockable costume in the next Resident Evil game? Great, thanks. Lastly, we do see him eating a steak dinner at the end of Resident Evil 6, so I wanted to take an estimation as to what we see on his plate. To me, it looks like we have potatoes, carrots, green beans, and a big juicy steak. The shape makes me assume it's a ribeye, which is fattier than something like a sirloin or a fillet, so this tracks with what we know about Chris's needs. We gotta get those calories in, so the fattier the better. For a 12-ounce ribeye steak, we are looking at 78 grams of protein, 72 grams of fat, and 2 grams of carbs, coming out to 960 calories. I'm estimating about 370 grams of potatoes on his plate, which comes out to 290 calories, 67 grams of carbs, almost no fat, and 8 grams of protein. 3 ounces of carrots and 3 ounces of green beans comes out to 2 grams of protein, 13 grams of carbs, and about 60 calories. Now, I don't know how these were prepared. More than likely they're covered in butter and other delicious things, but we're just keeping it simple in this example. So overall, Chris's victory meal of choice after saving the world for, I think would be the 4th time, comes out to 1,390 calories, 88 grams of protein, 72 grams of fat, and 80 grams of carbs. Hey, not bad for a day's work. Now, before you start eating upwards of 4,000 calories a day to look like Chris, keep in mind if you attempt this, you will more likely end up looking like the Duke from Resident Evil Village, and Chris is not a realistic standard by any stretch. But if you want to be the elite member of the BSAA, you have to train hard with revenge on your mind, most likely use performance-enhancing drugs, and eat absolutely enormous amounts of food to grow and maintain. Thanks for watching, and if you want more content like this, please make sure to like and subscribe. Thanks.